It costs less than a smartphone. It has no single owner, and it has killed more people than any other weapon ever made. You've seen its shape 1,000 times, on flags, on murals, in news footage from every corner of the planet. A curved magazine, a wooden stock, a silhouette so simple a child could draw it from memory. It was designed by a wounded tank sergeant who never finished engineering school. And in 70 years, it spread to more than 100 countries, armed more revolutions than any idea, and quietly became the most produced weapon in human history. This is the story of how one simple rifle took over the world. To understand the rifle, you first have to understand the war that demanded it. In 1941, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. It was the largest land invasion in history, and for the soldiers caught in it, the experience was a brutal lesson in firepower. Because on that Eastern Front, a problem that armies had argued about for decades suddenly became a matter of life and death. The problem was the rifle itself. For half a century, infantry had carried long, powerful, bolt-action rifles. They were accurate out to hundreds of meters, but they were slow. You fired one shot, worked the bolt by hand, and fired again. Against a charging enemy at close range, that was a death sentence. The alternative was the submachine gun. It sprayed pistol bullets fast, but those bullets were weak and useless past a short distance. Soldiers were stuck choosing between range and rate of fire. Nobody had both. The Germans found the answer first. Late in the war, they fielded a new kind of weapon, the Sturmgewehr, the storm rifle. It fired a smaller, lighter cartridge, not as powerful as a full rifle round, but far stronger than a pistol bullet. An intermediate cartridge. It could fire fully automatic and still hit a man across a field. It was the world's first true assault rifle, and it pointed straight at the future. The Soviets were paying attention. They began developing their own intermediate round, the 7.62 by 39 millimeter. Now they just needed a weapon to fire it. And here the story turns to an unlikely man. His name was Mikhail Kalashnikov. He was born in 1919 in a remote village in the Altai Mountains, the 17th child of a peasant family later branded enemies of the state and exiled. He had almost no formal education. What he had was a gift for taking machines apart and understanding exactly why they worked. When the war came, he served as a tank commander, and in October 1941, near the city of Bryansk, his tank was knocked out and Kalashnikov was wounded, hit in the shoulder, pulled from the battlefield, and sent to a hospital to recover. That hospital changed everything. Lying in his bed, surrounded by other wounded men, Kalashnikov listened, and what he heard over and over was a single complaint. Our weapons aren't good enough. The Germans have automatic firepower. We have bolt-action rifles from another century. Why can't Soviet soldiers have something better? Kalashnikov, a mechanic with no engineering degree and no money, decided he would build it himself. He didn't dream of fame. He wanted one thing, a weapon simple enough and tough enough that an ordinary frightened soldier could rely on it when everything around him was falling apart. It would take him years and several failures to get there, but the idea was now fixed in his mind. And what happened next would change warfare forever. By the mid-1940s, the Soviet Army wanted a new rifle, and they were willing to hold a competition to find it. Designers from across the country submitted their ideas. Most were trained engineers from established design bureaus. And then there was Kalashnikov, the self-taught outsider, working with a small team, learning as he went.
His early designs were rejected. A submachine gun? Passed over. A carbine? Turned down. But he kept refining, and in 1946, he submitted a new automatic rifle built around that intermediate cartridge. It was good. Good enough to advance. But good wasn't going to win.
One of Kalashnikov's assistants, a young engineer named Alexander Zaitsev, made a bold suggestion. Tear the design down and rebuild it with one obsession above all others: reliability. Kalashnikov hesitated. His rifle was already beating the competition. Why risk it? But he agreed. And that decision, to chase reliability over everything, is the reason you know this weapon's name today. The redesigned rifle was tested in brutal conditions. Dragged through sand, soaked in water, caked in mud, frozen, buried in dust. The kinds of conditions that jammed finer, more precise weapons. And the kinds of conditions real soldiers actually fight in. It kept firing. In 1947, the design was finalized. They called it the Automat Kalashnikova, the automatic of Kalashnikov, model of 1947. The world would come to know it by 3 letters and 2 numbers: AK-47. On the 18th of June, 1949, the Soviet Union officially adopted it. Mikhail Kalashnikov, the peasant's son, the wounded tank commander, the man with no diploma, had just designed the weapon that would define the next century of war. So what made it so good? Why this rifle out of all of them? The answer is everything it deliberately got wrong. The AK-47 was not built to be precise. Its parts fit together loosely, with gaps, with slack, with room to move. On paper, that's bad engineering. In the real world, it was genius. Because those loose tolerances meant dirt and grit had somewhere to go. Sand didn't seize it, mud didn't choke it, cold didn't freeze it solid. Where other rifles demanded careful cleaning and perfect conditions, the AK simply kept working. It was also brutally simple. Strip it down, and there are only a handful of major parts. A soldier could take the whole thing apart and put it back together in under a minute, in the dark, with cold hands, under fire. No special tools, no expert training. And that simplicity meant something bigger. It meant the rifle could be made cheaply, in enormous numbers, in basic factories, and eventually in little more than workshops. A weapon that was reliable, simple, and cheap to mass produce. There was a trade-off. At long range, the AK-47 was less accurate than the best Western rifles. But its makers understood something profound about modern war. Most fighting happens up close, in chaos, in the hands of tired and untrained men. And for that war, the real war, reliable beat perfect every single time. The Soviets had not just built a rifle. They had built the rifle for everyone. And soon, everyone would have it. A weapon is only as powerful as the number of hands that hold it. And this is where the AK-47 stopped being a rifle and became a phenomenon. The Soviet Union didn't just arm itself. It was now locked in a global struggle with the West, the Cold War, and it had something every ally wanted: a cheap, reliable weapon that anyone could use. So the Soviets did something extraordinary. They gave the design away. Across the Eastern Bloc, factory after factory began stamping out Kalashnikovs. Poland built them. East Germany built them. Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, each produced their own versions, often with their own small changes. The blueprints crossed borders as a tool of foreign policy.
arm your friends, and they fight your battles. Then came the giant. In 1956, China began producing its own copy, the Type 56. And China didn't build them in the thousands. It built them in the millions, and then exported those millions across Asia, into Africa, and throughout the Middle East. If the Soviet Union opened the door, China kicked it off its hinges. This was the birth of a global arms pipeline unlike anything before it. The AK wasn't sold the way Western weapons were, carefully, expensively, to approved governments. It was handed out, license-built, copied, and shipped by the crate to almost anyone the Soviet bloc wanted to support. Independence movements, friendly regimes, revolutionaries, whoever was useful. And because the rifle was so simple, those copies didn't degrade the idea. A Kalashnikov made in a Chinese factory, or an Egyptian one, or a Hungarian one, worked just like the original. The design was almost impossible to ruin.
By the time the dust settled, the AK-47 and its descendants had become the standard infantry weapon for over 100 countries. Think about that. Not a dozen, not 50. More than 100 nations on every inhabited continent carrying versions of the same rifle designed by one wounded sergeant. No other weapon had ever spread like this. And the spread wasn't really about armies anymore, because something else was happening. Out in the jungles, the deserts, and the mountains, far from any official battlefield. The AK-47 was about to become the weapon of the people who had nothing else. If you want to understand why the AK-47 became a legend, don't look at the great powers. Look at the small wars. Start in Vietnam. In the jungles and rice paddies, North Vietnamese soldiers and Viet Cong guerrillas carried the AK and the Chinese Type 56. The conditions were merciless. Heat, mud, monsoon rain, weeks without cleaning a weapon. And the AK just kept working. American troops, early in the war, were issued a rifle that could jam in those exact conditions. The reputation that grew out of that contrast was devastating. The enemy's cheap communist rifle worked when it mattered. Soldiers noticed. The world noticed. From Vietnam, the pattern repeated everywhere. Across Africa, as colony after colony fought for independence, the AK became the weapon of liberation. It was cheap enough that a movement with no money could arm itself. It was simple enough that a farmer who had never held a gun could be fighting with one within a day. In the Middle East, in Latin America, in Central Asia, wherever people picked up arms against a government or an empire, more often than not, they picked up a Kalashnikov. It became a symbol, and not just figuratively. When the African nation of Mozambique won independence and designed its flag, it put a real, modern rifle on it, an AK-47, complete with bayonet. To this day, Mozambique is the only country on Earth whose national flag features a modern firearm. On that flag, the rifle is crossed with a hoe and laid over an open book: defense, work, and education. The weapon, the land, and the mind. A nation that felt it had won its freedom with this rifle in its hands. And Mozambique was not alone in the symbolism. The hoe and rifle image appears on the coats of arms of other nations born from struggle. Armed movements around the world adopted the AK's silhouette into their banners and emblems. It became visual shorthand for a single idea: resistance. Why this rifle and not another? Because the AK offered something no ideology could. It leveled the battlefield. A teenager with 2 weeks of training and a Kalashnikov could stand against a professional soldier. It took the overwhelming advantage of wealthy, well-equipped armies
and chipped away at it. Firepower, once the privilege of nations, was now available to anyone who could get their hands on one of these, and millions could. That was the AK-47's true revolution, not any single war, the democratization of force itself. But every revolution has a cost, and the true price of putting this much firepower into this many hands was only beginning to come due. Let's talk about scale, because the numbers behind this rifle are almost impossible to imagine. The most common estimate is that more than 100 million AK pattern rifles have been produced. 100 million. That makes it, by a wide margin, the most produced firearm in the history of the world. No other weapon comes close. Now, a note of honesty. Nobody knows the exact figure. Because so many were built unofficially, copied, smuggled, assembled in unmarked workshops, estimates range anywhere from 35 million to 150 million. But even the lowest guess dwarfs every rival. When historians need a single number, they reach for 100 million. The truth is, the real total may be even higher, and it is still climbing. Where did they all go? Everywhere. And once a weapon this durable enters the world, it almost never leaves it. This is the dark genius of the AK-47's design turned against humanity. The very things that made it great, cheap, simple, nearly indestructible, also made it the perfect tool for endless conflict. A rifle built in the 1950s can still fire today. It gets captured, traded, buried, dug up, smuggled across borders, and used in a war its makers never imagined.
A vast shadow economy grew around it, state factories on one end, black market dealers on the other. In some war zones, a used Kalashnikov has changed hands for the price of a few $100s, sometimes far less. In the most flooded markets, it has been said you could buy one for the cost of a goat or a sack of grain. A weapon capable of automatic fire, available for pocket change. And that is the human cost hidden inside the production figures. Every one of those rifles is a tool that can be picked up by a child soldier, a militia, a bandit, or a terrorist as easily as by a national army. The AK didn't just arm wars between countries. It armed the long, grinding, low-level violence that has defined the world ever since, the kind that never quite ends. The man who designed it lived long enough to see all of it, and in his final years, the weight of those numbers began to press on him. So where does the story stand now, in the present day? The AK-47 never retired. It evolved. In 1974, the Soviets introduced the AK-74. Same basic design, but firing a smaller, faster, lighter round, the 5.45 millimeter. Less recoil, more rounds carried, more controllable on automatic. It became the new standard for Soviet and then Russian forces, and it remains in service, in modernized forms, to this day. The line kept going. In 2018, Russia officially adopted the AK-12, a thoroughly modern Kalashnikov with rails for optics and accessories, improved ergonomics, and updated materials, while keeping the beating heart of the original, that stubborn, reliable, gas-driven action that has worked for 70 years. Newer versions are still being delivered to the Russian military right now. But the original AK-47 and its close cousins haven't gone anywhere. Walk through the footage of almost any modern conflict and you will see them. Old rifles, decades old, still being carried, still being fired, still working. From the deserts of the Middle East to the forests of Africa to the front lines of Europe's wars, the Kalashnikov remains one of the most common weapons on the planet. It has also become something beyond a weapon, a global icon. Its silhouette appears in films, in music, in protest art,
in propaganda, in advertising. It is recognized instantly, almost everywhere, even by people who have never held a gun. Few human-made objects of any kind are this universally known. A curved magazine and a wooden stock have become one of the most recognizable shapes ever created. And the man whose name it carries? In his final years, Mikhail Kalashnikov, by then an old man, wrestled with what he had unleashed. Late in his life, he wrote a letter to the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. In it, he confessed an unbearable spiritual pain and asked an agonizing question. If his rifle had taken so many lives, was he, the designer, guilty for those deaths, even the deaths of enemies? For most of his life, he had insisted the blame lay with politicians, not with the man who built the tool. He said he had designed it to protect his homeland and that he slept soundly. But at the very end, the question would not leave him alone. He died in 2013 at the age of 94, a man who had built something far larger and far darker than he ever intended. So return to where we started. A rifle that costs less than a smartphone. A weapon with no single owner, copied, stolen, and rebuilt 100 million times over. A shape so simple a child can draw it, designed by a wounded man who only wanted to give ordinary soldiers a fighting chance. He succeeded beyond anyone's darkest imagination. He didn't just build a better rifle. He built the great equalizer of modern war, and in doing so, he helped arm nearly every conflict of the last 70 years, and the ones still burning today. That is the strange and terrible lesson of the AK-47. The most world-changing inventions are rarely the most complicated ones. Sometimes, all it takes to reshape history is a tool that is cheap enough, simple enough, and reliable enough to be placed into anyone's hands. The rifle is still out there, tens of millions of them, and its story is far from over. If you found this history as fascinating as we did, subscribe and stay with us for more of the hidden histories that quietly shaped our world.